Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriela Cabaña, and in this short video, I want to offer 3 points to think about basic income and about piloting basic income in the context of your debate today. So I would like to cover 3 main things. I want to explain very briefly what is basic income. I also going to talk about what we need to think through and with when we're thinking of implementing basic income. And finally, I'm going to make an argument of why I think basic income is a policy that is useful to think emancipatory processes more widely, not just about giving money to people. Okay, so first thing, we need to define what basic income is. And here's very important not to confuse it with other policies that sometimes use the name of guaranteed income or minimum income, which is not the same as basic income. So according to the Basic Income Earth Network, there are 5 characteristics of basic income. One is that it's a payment that is periodic, which means that you receive it in known and regular intervals. So it's not the same as, say, a one-off subvention or a one-off grant that you get, but actually it's an amount of money that you receive periodically. Then it's also a cash payment, which means that it uses general purpose money. It's not the same as giving a voucher or as giving something that is restricted, for instance, only for buying certain kind of goods. So like allows people the freedom to do whatever they want with their money. Third is individual, so it's given in an individual basis and not, for instance, to households. And this is one crucial difference with other policies that are usually family-based. Usually policies that give cash transfers assess the level of poverty or income of households according to the typical family model, and basic income doesn't do that. So it doesn't tie how much money you deserve or you need according to your particular arrangements, but like gives everyone the same. Then it's also universal, as the name says. Basic income is often referred to as universal basic income, which means it is paid to all without means test. Many of the cash transfers we have now are, for instance, related to being employed or unemployed, making a particular level of income. And in the case of basic income, this is not important. Like we don't want to give money to people just because they are unemployed, for instance. And then when they get a job, we take that benefit away from them, because this would, again, like create all sorts of incentives. Like if I'm already making money and I'm going to lose it if I get a job, like there's an incentive there to not act as freely as you would like. And finally, it's unconditional in the sense of it is paid without a requirement to work or without asking people to demonstrate the willingness to work. And I think this is probably like the main point of basic income that makes it different to what we understand as workfare-centered policies. So it is an income that acknowledges the right to every one of us to have the minimum means to subsistence without having to prove that we are somehow productive or contributing to society. It understands and acknowledges from the beginning that we're all important, that we all contribute, that we all create value, maybe not necessarily economic value, but that we're all valuable members of society, and therefore we shouldn't have our livelihoods connected only to our ability of finding wage work, right? We know that the economy recognizes only some forms of labor, makes other forms of labor invisible, and rather than trying to measure and to control exactly how to remunerate work, basic income says, beyond that, there is a certain common ground of income that we want to guarantee to all of us living in society. And I say living in society because the limits of universality they should be as wide as possible. So not necessarily only citizens, like in some places, some people could advocate for, say, anyone that is shown a permanent residence, or maybe anyone that's living there for more than 3 or 5 years, something like this. So you don't create like first and second class inhabitants of places, but it's supposed to be like as inclusive as possible. So anyone doing their life in a place where there is basic income is already entitled to receive one. Okay, so these are the basic characteristics of a basic income. And of course, it's a very ambitious policy. It's a policy that hasn't been implemented as such, that is as a right, as an inalienable right anywhere. But still, and this I'm already moving to my second point, there are already some initiatives and things that we have to keep in mind if we want to think about implementing basic income seriously. So the first thing I would like to say is that a basic income to work and to actually transform capitalism and not just work, as a support to keep things going as they are, needs to be considered in a wider setting. And what do I mean by this? It has to be part of a wider democratization of the economy. So it should be part of a process in which we recover the democratic control of, say, how we produce and we circulate our food, how much we pay for the places in which we live, the commodifying housing, and all these other things. Because otherwise, if you just give more money to everyone, then maybe all the prices will go up, right? So you need to make it part of a wider transformation, relocalization and decommodification of a number of things. And it can be complemented with other changes like universal basic services, for instance. It's not one or the other. It's actually part of a wider, as I said, democratization of the economy, and in which basic income is only one element. It's never the single element that is going to transform everything on its own. And the other important point that I think should be considered when you're having this debate and considering implementing basic income is about the funding. Because the way money works in our modern world and how we produce it and how we make it reflect value is deeply problematic. There is a very close coupling between money and fossil fuels and other damaging extractive activities. And if we want to fund basic income in the same way in which we today are funding other kind of cash transfers, we're going to be in huge ecological problems. So, for instance, today in Alaska, there is a sovereign fund that comes from oil that is distributed to all of Alaska inhabitants, which could be like, some people think this is what resembles more closely a basic income. But from a social, environmental, social, ecological perspective, this is not desirable, right? Like, we don't want to have this wealth coming from fossil fuels and then having a right like a basic income is going to be based on the extraction and exploitation of fossil fuels. So it would be much more interesting to think of other forms of creating value, creating and circulating value. For instance, in the case of Maricá in Brazil, basic income, like they're trying to move towards a basic income that covers still a proportion of the population, but it's increasing. It's based on a local currency. On a local currency that is guaranteed by the local government and that circulates value inside that municipality. Again, the original funding for that currency still comes from fossil fuels, but it still gives us like a blueprint to think of how we could create money that reflects what is done in a place and what the people actually need, like food, services, shelter, education, health, energy that is not based on fossil fuels. So we have to think on what kind of currency is going to be used very carefully. So because it's not just about doing whatever it's needed to get the money, right? Like if we're going to, for instance, extract a coal or do very toxic mining to get money for basic income, this is counterproductive. It shouldn't be at any cost. It should come, again, together with an idea of a wider reform of money and on a monetary system that is not based on endless economic growth, which is what we need today because of the way money is created and circulated. So I just mentioned this because there is plenty of information coming from pilots on basic income that can help think what are some of the obstacles that could come about when trying to implement it. And I think also it's very important to think that basic income can be pilots, as what you're discussing today, but it can also be implemented gradually. So it's not necessary to go from 0 to 100. Like maybe we can start with smaller proportions of the population, or maybe with smaller or more marginalized communities or municipalities in a context, and then move and make it grow until it encompasses all the population. So also maybe start with a lower amount and then see how it goes. So we have the room to make adjustments. Like all these things are part of designs of implementation of basic income. And I think here also an important possibility to think together now in your debate is, for instance, what would it mean to start implementing basic income in places that have been heavily destroyed and heavily damaged by extractive and environmentally damaging activities? And what if we made it part of like this reparations process in the redistribution of wealth, and from then we can expand that right to the wider population? This is something I think is worth considering. And I say this because of the deeper and for me the more interesting anti-productivist ethics that is embedded in basic income. So we often hear, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, that So often we defend destructive economic activities and pollution, I don't know, manufacturing of cars, mining, and other kind of things that we know are not good for the environment, but we often defend them because they create jobs, right? So they allowed people to take care of their families, to support them. And we're often in this like back and forth, in this like tension between what is sometimes called the end of the world and the end of the month. And you know, this is a real problem, and basic income somehow breaks this connection. So it says, you know, you don't need your livelihood to be based on this destructive activity. We, all of us as a society, acknowledge the value of all of us and are giving ourselves the capacity to live without feeling hostage of these industries, because so often this is what it happens, right? It generates this sense of dependency of these extractive activities, even though we might not need them, or we might want to reform the services that this is catering. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we could all move to a system in which private cars are no longer needed, and we have other systems that provide mobility. But there is this real sense of dependency on the creation of jobs. So this giving more economic freedom to people and more room to make moral decisions that are not just based on what is going to give them money, because they already have that basic, you know, very modest but very solid and unconditional ground of money. It's very important. So just to be closing this, why bet for basic income? Why do I think, and many of us defending basic income and advocating for it think it's so important? It has to do precisely about what I was just saying, of how to move towards a society that is less addicted and dependent on growth for guaranteeing the well-being. It can give space to make us all more capable of living different lives than the ones we're living, you know, like less focus on productivism, less focus on compensatory forms of consumption that we just do because we're tired and we want to, like, you know, escape from our very demanding jobs. And we can move towards more creative lives, when we have more time to take care of each other, of the planet, of the people we love, and we can move to a more social and environmentally just world. So I hope this gives you some clues and some ideas to think about what it would mean to pilot a basic income.